material, aesthetic, and ethical concerns that come with operating within this context. So I'd like to begin with some background of the thesis research to kind of frame my central questions, and then I'll move on to the design work in the later part of the presentation. Sites like the Newtown Creek can be deemed as anxious landscapes, a term used by Antoine Picon to describe this image here of New Jersey as foregrounding the view of Manhattan. And I'm interested in the terminology that he uses to describe these landscapes, a sprawling hell or purgatory that's irreparably polluted yet somehow endowed with a strange beauty, and much more real in its crudeness than the distant sparkling of the Empire State and Chrysler buildings. The reason that he calls these landscapes anxious landscapes is because of the way that they make us feel. And the reason they make us anxious is because there's a real kind of ambiguity within these landscapes. They're not as clear-cut as ruins. And so it's difficult for us to kind of determine where the human influence begins and ends in these landscapes, or where the line exists between natural and anthropic layers. Roberto Cassini incorporates this idea into a chronological progression of concepts of site that lands with what he terms territory, which is an encompassing term that includes the interaction between the natural platform and superimposed anthropic layers. So the idea that the natural and human conditions are kind of conflated and equalized. Bridging these two and bringing them together into a singular kind of concept of territory presents an exciting challenge and opportunity for designers. So how is it that we operate in a context where everything and nothing is natural? Francois Roche offers territorialized architecture as a strategy here, an approach that rejects the imposition of some sort of preconceived ideal order over site, and rather kind of looks to the peculiarities and the particularities of site to try to exacerbate them, embedding architecture in the site and exacerbating issues of mutation and identity. So if we kind of cast judgments aside and think about what sites really present to us, it can produce interesting results, like here, a building that accumulates particulate matter from air pollution. So this is an approach I'm interested in engaging on the Newtown Creek. David Gisson, in his book Subnature, draws upon his expanded definition of nature, offering the concept of subnature, or the forms of nature that are deemed primitive, filthy, fearsome, or uncontrollable. He argues that they're generally excised from architectural practice and landscape architectural practice, even though these are environments that are a reality of our condition. And he significantly argues that they can be productive mediums for design. So that's something that I'm exploring in this project. With regard to toxic territory and the stigma that's associated with it, Vittoria De Palma argues that wasteland is purely a cultural construct rather than an inherent characteristic of landscapes. So like subnatures, we tend to marginalize these environments, but at the same time, the term is malleable, and so something's really only wasteland if we decide that it is. And the other point from De Palma that's interesting is the idea that she argues that wasteland is essential and instrumental in forming a landscape ideal. So as cultural constructs, the idea of subnature and wasteland is rooted in disgust, a strong visceral reaction that's tied to multiple senses. It's the basis for casting moral judgment, designating otherness, and it's been described by Mary Douglas as the very formation of societal order. So under this premise, cleaning a toxic site by any means necessary would generally be considered to be a virtuous act. And in my thesis work, I'm interested in kind of challenging this preconception. From the vantage of aesthetics, disgust is perplexing and provocative because of its ability to both repel and to attract. It has what we can refer to as a paradoxical magnetism, and it doesn't necessarily provoke an all or nothing response based on pure rejection or outright approval. Rather, it can facilitate appreciative regard and understanding. By invoking or provoking disgust, we can utilize it towards political, social, religious, and aesthetic ends. When we're discussed did we really have a heightened sense of awareness. So for this thesis, discussed is a key aesthetic framework with which to challenge the presumed virtuousness of cleaning or sanitizing toxic sites. As designers, we walk kind of a fine line when we're engaging these sites, because if we repress or sanitize, we're sort of following this idea of kind of ordering the disorder that's dirt, but by eviscerating these disgusting phenomena and continuing to marginalize subnature, we're really kind of missing out on some interesting opportunities. So to quote David Gisson, ultimately, we can marginalize subnature in architecture in the name of the natural, or we might consider excuse me, the possibilities of exploiting subnature as a form of agitation or intellectual provocation. So this leads me to the central questions of the thesis, of which there are three. The first, in an irrevocably altered landscape where restoration is neither materially possible nor philosophically tenable, how might the materials, aesthetics, and ethics of architectural and landscape architectural practice be transformed? So as designers, do we have a responsibility to kind of promote cleanliness at all costs? Is there a point at which a site is so severely altered that it causes us to sort of question our baseline assumptions of what it is a site should do in terms of ecological performance or the forms of life that it can support? The second, in as much as we've created the landscapes of cities, we've also created the hell or purgatory of landscapes of waste and infrastructure that support them. Can the tools of architecture and landscape architecture harness aesthetic disgust to evoke appreciative regard for, and perhaps even pleasure within, this perceived wretchedness? So here, the idea that cities necessarily rely on these landscapes of waste and infrastructure, and the city is ultimately tied to them. So do we, as designers, at some point kind of choose to advocate for the viability of these sites as they are, rather than promote their transformation into something else? And the third question, how can a territorialized architecture within a toxic landscape embed itself in what it was supposed to dominate? Can design mitigate the harmful impact aspects of toxicity without entirely negating its unique material characteristics and affects? So to say, with Francois Roche, the idea of exacerbating these conditions is interesting and provocative, but to pretend that toxic sites don't actually present real danger is pretty naive. But then also at the same point to think that some of these sites should perform exactly and perform and look and feel exactly as an idealized form of nature is also a little bit naive. So I'm interested in exploring an alternative method of engaging these toxic sites that can provide a benefit over the long term while still facilitating a unique experiential engagement of the site. And I believe that remediation doesn't necessarily need to be synonymous with sanitization. So what my project aspires to is to create a network of territorial superimpositions that together will challenge normative cultural attitudes towards wastelands to the transformation of a site of extreme environmental degradation by employing the paradoxical magnetism of disgust through a concentrating program around hotspots, which are duly defined as sites of extreme toxicity and places of concentrated activity, in order to provide a progressive vision for the future in which the products of anthropogenic process are accepted as an everyday component of the human condition and as a viable medium for design. So again, just the idea that is there a way that we can start to engage these sites in a way that that brings us into dialogue with the way that they exist and what they do for us. So the concept of the hotspot is central to the design approach. Based on the dual definition of hotspot as both a place of significant activity and a place of significant danger, considering the idea that disgust is based on physical proximity, the notion of the hotspot leads to concentrating program around areas with these highest concentration of subnatures on the Newtown Creek. So one of the precedents that I was looking at in terms of utilizing sort of environmental phenomena to order spaces, the Face Shifts Park, and in the end, they determined that all of these most uncomfortable areas were the places where they should put buildings and parking lots in more conditioned environments. And I'm interested in kind of inverting this and saying, what if we start in these places instead of leaving those for something else? So David Gisson, in his definition of subnature, identifies three major categories: matter, life, and atmosphere. And I initially intended to use these as a strategy for kind of mapping and analysis, but as I started to look at how these really play themselves out on the site, in the Newtown Creek, they're not really so distinct. Rather, they collectively define and encompass many of the things that we typically consider to be emblematic of an impaired or unhealthy environment. Things like intense algal blooms, invasive plants, putrid smells, mud, and garbage, to name a few. So from the standpoint of this thesis, these forms of matter, life, and atmosphere aren't other. They're just endemic to the conditions of the site, and they form the material basis of my design work. So I'm working with the Newtown Creek. It's located in the geographic center of New York City. It is both an industrial business zone and a significant maritime industrial area. And we'll see that later that there's really a lot of intense rezoning pressure here, but when you zoom out to the scale of the city, you can really see that it's really pretty important that this remain an industrial zone. It does a lot of work for a lot of people. The blue is the watershed boundary, and the brown outline is the sewer shed boundary for the Newtown Creek wastewater treatment plant. It services a population of about 1 million people over 3 boroughs. Like a lot of urban waterways, it's been severely altered over time and really has lost any kind of sense of functioning as the tidal estuary that it once was. The site has a long and storied history with industry. Some of the first oil refineries were on this site. Every kind of nasty industry was here, and it really kind of transitioned from shipbuilding into heavy industry in the mid to late 19th century. And it didn't take long for people to begin to comment on and complain about it. This is a stench map from 1878. People in Manhattan are being affected by things like the oil refineries, the fat rendering facilities, and things like that that are on the Newtown Creek, and saying that the winds are carrying these smells. These are political cartoons from an 1880 issue of Harper's Magazine. On the left here, these are witches in Hunter's Point around a cauldron. And this is a woman kind of dying underneath an incenser with sludge acid, and everyone's really sad that the kid's plugging his nose. And what's interesting to me is that insofar as these things are derided, they're also, from another standpoint, seen as an opportunity. So in this Merchants Association of New York report from 1921, they say that the Newtown Creek should be specifically of interest to manufacturers whose processes are noisy, dusty, odorous, or in some other way obnoxious. Which is really interesting. I was excited about that language when you think about the terms that David Gisson uses to define subnature as the forms of nature that are primitive, filthy, fearsome, or uncontrollable. So clearly these kinds of things are intimately tied to the identity of the creek. So today, what exists is a creek that's bounded entirely by direct drainage areas. There's no stormwater or sewer infrastructure. All of the freshwater inputs from the tidal estuary have been replaced by combined sewer outfalls. The 5 largest are at the mouth of each one of the tributaries. So the only influence that gets any water into or out of here is tide, which really only extends to about here, and so everything that's going in just sits. It's also the site of the 2nd largest oil spill in United States history that remains in an underground oil plume, and there's an active kind of recovery that's happening, but it's sort of nested within the fabric and you never really see it. It is a federal Superfund site, and I bring this up and I discuss this history really just to kind of speak to the complexity of the issues that face the creek and the notion of this being almost, an irrevocably altered landscape. And this situation politically has implications for the creek in that these are the 6 potentially responsible parties for the Superfund cleanup. All of these oil companies, including the one of our incoming Secretary of State, have pooled their resources to push as much of the blame on the city of New York as possible. So the city of New York is desperate to try to make combined sewer outfalls seem like less of a problem. And they're kind of interested in taking any means necessary to do that. So they've already introduced mechanical aeration on parts of the creek, and advocacy organizations are fearing that chlorination of water coming into the combined sewer outfalls may be part of a long-term plan. So again, the idea of kind of all of this in the name of increasing dissolved oxygen levels for aquatic life, and the idea that mechanical aeration or injecting chemicals is a restoration agenda is kind of interest to me. Many people know the Gowanus Canal. It's really notorious. It's about a third of the size of the Newtown Creek. And people are calling for a similar remedy on the Gowanus Canal, but this is a $500 million project, so can the Newtown Creek really be dealt with that way? So despite all of this intro, the site really, going back to what Picon talks about, this strange beauty, it's really bizarrely austere and serene. These are photos from a canoe trip that I took down the Newtown Creek. And I initially thought that I was going to look at mapping exercises to figure out, I'm going to determine exactly where all the toxicity is. But when you look at these images, it really, to understand where it is toxicity begins and ends, and where resilient natural systems are trying to kind of fight their way through, is really difficult. And one of these images actually contains an ecological restoration project. It's this right here. This is a native wetland restoration happening and on Dutch Kills. So moving into the design, initially I was interested in utilizing these hotspots as kind of nodes, thinking about the transformation of the whole creek system-wide. So I was looking at case studies of this kind of network place, thinking about the infrastructural lines that exist on the site, and looking at Potteries Think Belt, or looking at things like Regent's Canal, where these sort of character-defining episodic interventions are linked and help to kind of create an overall transformation. But as I got into it a little bit more, I thought this is kind of the wrong approach. There are conversations coming out, specifically of the Newtown Creek and Greenpoint, about the idea of a just green enough approach to the design of public space, in that to connect all of these into a larger continuous system is kind of conserved to commodify the creek. So instead, I was looking at taking these hotspots and using them to create these kind of smaller isolated networks. So the 4 hotspots are Whale Creek up here. It's where sewage transfer takes place daily. ExxonMobil oil spill, obviously that's where the oil spill happened. Maspeth Creek over here is kind of off on its own. It's the shallowest and one of the most polluted branches of the creek, with relatively sparse industry. And English Kills here, facing intense rezoning pressure, burgeoning art scene, and also this intersection here is the place where 30 to 40% of New York City garbage funnels through on its way out. I ultimately chose to focus on 2 of these to develop further in terms of the design work, and the first being Maspeth Creek. So Maspeth Creek is located kind of between, this is Greenpoint over here, industrial areas in Maspeth, Queens is off the map over there, but it's really very isolated right now. It also has some pretty, it's one of the largest stretches of vegetated riparian zone. One major project that's bringing activity here is the construction of the new Kajuba Bridge, which is going to bring pedestrian circulation, bicycle lanes, and public space underneath. So what I'm looking at is developing this node as a sub-nature walk and a way to be able to experience a variety of different environments along the creek. This is National Grid. So what's interesting, and I'll get into it in a minute, is the juxtaposition of a view here over this kind of the oil tanks over to the city beyond, and then here within the creek itself. And so the major design intervention here that I'm looking at is this connection across in designing a bridge. And so the notion of the bridge, what I'm interested in is not this kind of idea of a triumph over nature and a distinction from it, but the idea that a bridge can actually bring you down into the kind of nasty and interesting particularities of the material conditions of this site. So working through the design work, I methodologically was working in two kind of parallel trajectories. One, a series of material investigations, and the other more informed programmatic and infrastructural research. So these are some material studies that are thinking about the idea of how a fibrous medium can transform flows, but then also be transformed by them as well. And so I looked at deploying these at the scale of the site, some study models of a connection across that is really kind of embedded within the creek rather than a triumphant march across it. And these are some of those studies removed from this jig that I built. This is the configuration that I chose to move forward with, informed by the kind of site analysis. So here, there's a containment boom that traps floatables within the creek. It's super shallow, so there's really intense algal blooms here. There's a very clearly defined trajectory that the combined sewer outfall discharge takes along here. There's some relic rail lines along here, and so the idea is to kind of loop this into a larger network. The prevailing winds kind of follow the trajectory, so this is pretty stinky here too. And the major kind of infrastructural engagement that kind of plays on the idea of cultivating what's here is the introduction of an algal turf scrubber system that really just, it pumps water from the creek, sheets it across these screens, and then as the algae grows, it takes up the nutrients, increases the dissolved oxygen levels. So this is kind of performing the same task that some of the aeration or chlorination might do, but it does it through the cultivation of what's existing here. So rather than demonize and eradicate this algae, how can we make it part of this? This is also the best place in the Newtown Creek to go bird watching. And I thought it was really interesting and ironic that that's happening here when you have this kind of opposition of a view of these tanks in the city beyond, and then also this almost sort of preserve in a sense. So the architecture of this piece is looking to specifically curate views so that the idea of like a duck blind or a bird blind is filtering views both to the to this kind of vegetative riparian zone, but then also across to the city beyond. So this is the plan of the bridge in context. Up here, the public space, and then down here, a little street end park, and then the loop would kind of pass by a recycling facility to really kind of get a sense of what that is like. Zooming in, the connection from up top. This is trying to minimally impact, if at all, the industrial operations on site. And so here, the bridge crossing over, this is an interior pavilion here that houses the tanks and the algal cultivation below. So in section, the bridge kind of both crosses over, but then allows you to come down onto this really shallow surface. And at the end of the creek here, the idea that this bridge really sort of envelops and wraps around both sides. As you approach it, again, the idea that it can kind of come up and over as well as down, foregrounding the algal turf screens. And by having this interior volume, the idea is that you can really get up close and personal with these tanks of polluted water, but then also you can occupy the site in a rain event and be able to see all of this combined sewer outfall discharge as it's rushing down the creek. And then also the ability to be able to get down and up close to both the water that's very shallow and then walk through these algae screens that would be kind of continuously sheeting the water. So the second site, English Kills, this is the site that is the concentration of a lot of New York City garbage. This is the garbage train here. This is an area that is most closely adjacent to residential fabric and facing a lot of rezoning pressure. And it's a burgeoning art and music scene here in East Williamsburg and Bushwick. All of the purple dots are music venues and recording studios. The yellow are art studios and galleries. And so what I'm interested in is kind of, instead of trying to displace this waste transfer that's happening to sort of unite this kind of energy in the neighborhood with the this piece that a lot of people want to see go. And in terms of material studies here, I was looking at using heat as a generative component, thinking about the subnatures here of intense heat island effect, air pollution from all of the truck traffic. And so thinking about how layering these different materials can start to speak to layering program and appending these sort of extensions off of buildings to facilitate connections across the creek and really open things up to it. And as much as they hover over, they also look to make connections to the creek.
It's 25 minutes.
Okay, almost done. So then here, just in terms of this sort of infrastructural programmatic kind of analysis, this is the string of buildings that are dealing with waste transfer and the circulation along the site here to transfer onto the garbage train. And the idea that these extensions don't interrupt any of that, but rather allow for those operations to continue. And then these new uses are superimposed over the top of and cut into this existing sanitation garage here, so that the public circulation can actually come up and be free of any kind of interaction with or interruption to the daily industrial operations. And in the same way that the structure on the bridge site conveys water, the idea that these could facilitate an engagement of water on these roofs with the dynamic system here, mechanical aeration happening here, combined sewer outfall here. And that the scaffold also would host planting of honeysuckle that would start to introduce another olfactory layer to this site that's full of garbage. But that honeysuckle itself actually, because of the kind of hairs on it, can help to absorb particulate and air pollution. And then the idea that on nights and weekends, this scaffold provides rigging or structure for performance events. So being able to occupy this site and take advantage of this massive land area that's really only in use kind of 9 to 5. So employing the material studies on the site and translating them, focusing in really on this building and the connection across here into the site plan, moving into the building. It both cuts into the building and extends above it. So this is in, I'll show you in the section, cuts into a plenum zone of the structure of this existing building. And then, so art studios gallery up here, rigging for stage below, and then another building to the south that kind of helps to frame this space. And then in section, the idea that this piece cuts into the building, extends out, and crosses over the creek, and really opens it up to the neighborhood where right now it's completely cut off. And so again, then the idea that these sites could be cross-programmed for other uses, and then transitioning from day to night, the idea that in the day it really is this active industrial site, but then at night provides a pretty cool place for parties. So in the end, I guess by way of conclusion, I wanted to close with this Bucky Fuller quote that pollution is nothing but the resources we're not harvesting. We allow them to disperse because we've been ignorant